Lindsay DuPré. My Métis family is originally from Manitoba, connected to Roblin, Shaw River, Red River, and Versailles Village. I have Métis, Cree, Scottish, English, Irish, and French ancestry. But I was born and raised in the Toronto area. And so I've spent most of my life on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. And so I have deep care and respect and gratitude to the nations on this territory that I've come to learn so much from. I'm also a mom to a busy, almost 2-year-old toddler named Kisik, and Kisik and my partner are members of Waterhen Lake First Nation in northern Saskatchewan. Outside of my roles as a mom and co-founder of the Mamawi Project, I am the Indigenous Education Liaison at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. So I work at the Dean's Office, helping oversee Indigenous education initiatives there. And I'm also a sessional professor at York University in the School of Social Work. I have my MSW from U of T. I'll leave it there as far as my introduction, but Lucy and I will both embed more about ourselves and our relationship to this work throughout the presentation. Lucy?
Awesome, thanks, Lindsay. So I'm Lucy. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, but I'm currently living on Taino lands with my partner and our dog. They are not here right now. Normally I give a puppy warning at the beginning of any presentation because she's very loud, but I don't have to do that today. So I am also a sessional instructor at the moment. I teach Indigenous education courses as well as other courses about colonization and Indigenous peoples in Canada. But I am starting a full-time faculty position on July 1st at the University of Manitoba. So we're really excited to be here and talk a little bit about this project that we both co-founded and along with Justin Weeb and some other folks, and have been really passionate about kind of developing some of the initiatives. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the Mamawi Project itself, so where it came from. We came together just over 2 years ago. So some of us have been talking about and searching for a place to kind of gather and co-create stories and share our culture and share a vision of our future that we wanted for our Métis Nation. We didn't always feel represented or listened to within our nation, so we thought we could create this space for ourselves and for our relatives. So we've done this in a variety of ways that we'll talk about today, through digital storytelling, in-person gatherings, virtual dialogues, social media presence, zine, a number of other initiatives as well. The name Mamawi was suggested by collective member Kai Pyle, who is the second from the left on the bottom row there. They suggested the name Mamawi because Mamawi in Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis means together. So when we talk about Mamawi, we're often talking about telling stories together or working together. And that really embodied what we saw the Mamawi Project being, a place where we could, laugh together, but also learn together and work together and do some collective action together. So folks in the collective have family roots from the prairies, as well as parts of Ontario, BC, Northwest Territories, and the Northern United States. So these are just the folks who've been involved in the collective for the past few years. And like, this isn't like a two-person group, right? We all have different passions and different interests that we kind of pursue or explore through the project. So I want to share a little bit about some of the different initiatives that we've done, but I'll first turn it back over to Lindsay.
Yeah, and I would just add also as framing, the Mamawi Project came at a very particular point in time in broader conversations around Métis identity and community building. And one of the concerns that we had within our, casual conversations amongst our friendships was how conversations and understandings of Métis people and knowledge and cultures were often being very boxed into just identity politics and, who is and isn't Métis. And To be clear, those are really important conversations, and they're ones that we participate in certain ways. But our concern was that there's so many other important conversations that need to happen, so many other, opportunities for us to know who we are, to apply our values or teachings and our knowledges in new and important ways to carry out our responsibilities as well. So we were, not at all saying we don't want to talk about identity politics, but we were wanting to create a new space where we could dig in deeper to what it really does mean to be Métis, and especially in thinking through right now at this point in time with a range of different challenges and harms being faced by Indigenous peoples, in what's now known as Canada and globally, to start having more critical conversations in other ways as well. So this graphic that we put together more or less covers what our theory of change is, I guess I would say, to describe the Mamawi Project's work. So in the top corner there, saying like stronger Métis nation. So ultimately that's what we're driven by. We want to create a stronger nation for our peoples, our families, and our children that are coming up. And for us to try and figure out what that looks like, we needed to start with identifying where are the key areas where we see violence continuing to happen, or see possibilities for more care to take place and values to protect. So just to the left of that blue Stronger Métis Nation bubble, those pieces there are all talking of those values. So for us, we're driven by the need to protect the land and care for future generations. So engaging in conversations around land protection and restoring relationships to land and our responsibilities there. Strong relationships with other Indigenous nations. Many of us noted how in some spaces, some Métis people were contributing to harm, or there was a need to talk about how, for some of us, not all Métis people carry whiteness in the same way, but I know for myself, really trying to hold myself accountable to that and thinking about the nuances of how that intersects with other aspects of our identity and how we relate to other Indigenous peoples on different territories. Also then to know our history, language, and culture. And I should clarify there should be an extra S, because as Métis peoples, there isn't just one language. Most people think of us as being connected only to Michif, but as Lucy mentioned, there's threads of Anishinaabe-Moan, of Cree, and different dialects within those as well, depending on which parts of the homeland our people are from. Then absence of misogyny and harms of patriarchy. So that's been very much on our mind, and some of our concerns about current and recent political leadership and the ways that we've experienced being in spaces with some of these leaders in our communities, or these politicians in our communities rather, as well as in other spaces outside of political bodies as well, how misogyny and patriarchy takes form. And then youth empowered to lead and make change. So we're really interested in not just thinking about youth leadership as a tokenistic, buzzword or buzz area, which I would say it has been over the past 5 years or so, but to really see young people's gifts as a tool to generate important change and future building. And for us as Métis people, we are trying to leverage technology as a way to mobilize those gifts and knowledge sharing as led by young people. And then centering of two-spirit people and knowledge. And so wanting to make sure that spaces that we're convening and other spaces within our communities are safer for two-spirit people who are often being marginalized or facing different forms of violence. But beyond just safety, realizing that there is so much incredible knowledge and gifts there that we can also use and reference as we're trying to dream up the future that we're working towards. And then lastly, the importance of trying to create a future for Métis people, a nation that is free of anti-Blackness. And this is huge. And we haven't just been thinking about this, you know, in the past year or so, but this has been going on for a long time. And it's something that we're dedicated to, and trying to support members of our community who are navigating their Métis identity in ways different from us, and facing different challenges and harms both internally and externally from our nation. And then again, moving left, two over, the left-hand side there, those are the areas of activities I would say that we carry out. So knowledge mobilization being a chunk of them, and relationship building. That's the key areas of work that we try and do. So social media posts, publications, and resource development, interviews and presentations, just like this. And then relationship building, including in-person gatherings, and now virtual gatherings, calls and hangouts, sometimes just a casual one amongst our collective and others in our network, and everyday relationships, you know, leaning on each other, calling each other to celebrate, to express in times of stress and hardship. We see that as being the work, and trying to celebrate that work that is happening just as we're being there for one another. And then those kind of explosions there in the middle, those are really our ethics or our processes for how we try and do this, and how we're trying to connect, again, the activities to the actual values that we're carrying out. So first being ongoing reevaluation of priorities. So we're very responsive. You know, we're a grassroots collective. We're not, you know, an organization bound by a board of directors or anything like that. We're really just a group of people that want to be in relationship to each other and think through these things. And that gives us flexibility to adapt as we need to, and reevaluate our priorities as we see fit. And then leveraging gifts and connections. So as we said, thinking about how the youngish people, that's the language we often like to use, as some of us, you know, move past 30, how our youngish people are able to contribute in different ways through this unique technological platform. And then accessing resources. So thinking about how we can get resources, not just financial, but different forms of support to make these things happen. And then care and capacity. For me, that's the most important one, and how we're trying to really carry this out through our process just as much as the outcome of the activities. So for us, that looks like sometimes big chunks of time where we're not doing anything. And to some people that may look like, oh, they're falling apart, or the work is fizzling out, when really, again, I think that is part of the work. And it's realizing that rest can be powerful resistance, and to recognize the limitations that we all have. And when showing care really looks like just slowing things down.
So we'll share a little bit about some of the different initiatives that we've taken on in the past, and then we'll talk more about some of the things that we've been doing in response to COVID to kind of build community. So these are some photos from our Journeying Home gathering that we had in 2019. In July 2019, we brought together some Métis youth from across the nation to come to Saskatchewan, come together and connect with a range of different important sites historically and culturally, but also connect with each other and build some of those kinship ties for folks that might not have had the chance to meet in person otherwise. We also had a chance to meet with some people who were very tied to different historical events in that area and different cultural events as well. So we had like experiential activities, relational and land-based activities as well. And created a documentary out of it by filming and interviewing all of the folks who were participating. So during that gathering, we met with and learned from some amazing people in Saskatoon and the surrounding areas. We went to Round Prairie to meet with Angie and Ken Curon. We had a walking tour of Duck Lake. We sat with Maria Campbell in conversation. We visited Fort Carlton, Fish Creek, and the Battle of Duck Lake sites. We went together to the Back to Batoche days and celebrated our culture together. And we also, watched films and learned from collective member Erin Consumo how to make fish scale art, which was much more difficult than I was anticipating, but it was a really great bonding experience for all of us as well. So some of those moments were created not just in kind of like the scheduled activities and the things that we were doing, but also in those moments of sitting together and eating and sharing space, and those kind of casual, organic conversations that came up through spending 5 days together, staying in the same building and going places together. These are some of our other initiatives that were from like social media kind of focused. On the top left there is an example of some of our language posts. So as I mentioned, Kai in our group they are learning many different languages. Métis is one of them, as well as Anishinaabe, and I think they also know a bit of Cree as well. So Kai really took on the initiative to kind of create these language posts. But the idea was that we would share a word in one of the languages that are connected to our nation, so that people could start to learn not just how to say a word, but kind of think about the connections that we have to the land and to each other that are kind of shown through the words that we have in our languages. The second post there in the center at the top, the Celebrating Together. So it's a series of kind of highlights of different Métis folks from across the homelands who have been doing incredible work in a variety of different ways. So through these questions, we pose the same questions to folks and then kind of create a profile of them and post it on our social media, our Medium sites, as well as Facebook and Instagram. So we ask, well, where are you from? So you can tell us about your Métis family, but also the other questions are, as a Métis person, how do you walk in a way that honors your responsibilities to our nation, other Indigenous communities, the land and waters? I think that question really exemplifies kind of those guiding principles or ethics that we have as a collective. Those are the priorities that we have, and we wanted to share not just collective member stories, but the stories of other Métis folks who are doing this hard work across the homelands. We also had a zine launch party. It's in the top right there, right near the beginning of lockdown. And it was a really incredible experience. We'll talk more about the zine throughout this presentation. But the zine came from that gathering that we had in Saskatchewan. So sitting with Maria Campbell, she talked about this concept of visiting Kiokewan. So she talked about how colonialism has divided our peoples, our cultures, our laws, and our languages, but those pieces all come back together when we visit each other. So we put a call out to folks to submit art or writing or something that reflects this concept, and we'll share a few of those stories later on. These pieces at the bottom on the second row are kind of a reflection of some of the different posts that we make that are more in response to actions happening in the moment. So it's kind of an attempt to engage other Métis folks across the nation who may not be thinking about or engaging in these issues in the same way, to encourage solidarity with other Indigenous peoples and other racialized people as well. And so just trying to bring conversations into the forefront that may not have been happening in other kind of national spaces.
All right. So the title of our presentation today is using language where emergent technologies are waterways to the Métis homeland. And that's, a new way that when Lucy and I were talking about doing this presentation, we wanted to frame the work because we were trying to make sense of it. And sometimes I think technologies can be viewed with a bit of fear or hesitation in our communities, or some people in our communities anyway, where it may be viewed as though it's separate or disconnected from land itself and land-based relationships and learning. And so our perspective on that and how we're trying to understand our work is not to see technology and the use of social media and other technologies as a replacement for land-based learning, working, and visiting, but instead as tools or waterways, as we've put it, to build and strengthen our relationship to the homeland. And for us as Métis people, we've always been adaptable and resourceful. So our use of technologies today is just another example of this. So in the past, when we think about important items in our culture, like the sash, the sash was used in innovative ways to support our people's work, both as voyageurs, but also in other areas of life. Thinking of how it could be used as a sling when you're out on the land, how it could be used as to cup water when you needed it, to provide some warmth around your neck. There's countless different uses for how just that one item alone is used. That speaks to the versatility and adaptability and resourcefulness of our people. So thinking about technologies in that same way, and our natural ability or our historic ability to adapt in our current situations, technology is doing that for us today, and particularly now through a global pandemic, and that has required us to be isolated from one another. We're thinking about how these technologies, again, can actually be part of our culture, not disconnected from it, but actually a cultural tool. Due to the history of diasporic movement for Métis, many Métis families and across our nation, there are some Métis families that are no longer living on the Métis homeland. So some of us, our families, either very recently or in the past few generations, have left the Métis homeland for different reasons, including my family. That's part of our story. And so my grandfather, he was spent the beginning parts of his childhood in Manitoba, and then he and his family, after my great grandfather had trouble and challenges with the RCMP and experiences with poverty, took opportunity to move down south, where my great grandma's parents had moved as well. And so with that movement, that's just one story of countless of reasons why Métis people have moved across the homeland and some outside of it. And with that movement has in some ways disconnected us from community spaces and our relationships with one another. And our connection to our homeland is critical to our identity. So thinking about that movement, thinking about that changing relationship to place is something that's important to us and within Métis conversations, because our identity cannot be disconnected from that relationship to land in the present, but also our historic relationships there. And so as I said, and maintaining that relationship to those lands is essential. So we're trying to think about how technologies can further that. So we believe that virtual community building can and should center land. It's not about replacing land-based work, but creating new waterways to connect to it. And that doesn't mean that, every post we do or every conversation we host very clearly states that it's focusing on land, but it's almost like an accountability mechanism for us to keep coming back to how is our work relating back to our responsibilities to where we're from, and how does that help us organize ethics for doing our work in good ways. Just to build on this a little bit further, our homeland covers a number of shared territories with other Indigenous nations. And so we have responsibilities within these relationships on physical lands and also in digital spaces. So that's something we've been grappling with, of how do we translate that? Because we know that in person, in a physical sense, those relationships and those ethics, there's challenges there. We think about harmful relationships that happen in certain places between our nation and other Indigenous nations, or and not always harmful, but also just challenging, and it needs work like any relationship. And so we acknowledge that being a challenge in physical places, but also then in digital spaces, we see that happening, where we're really needing to think carefully about how we're relating to one another. And we're using technologies to encourage conversations about being good relatives. So maybe we're not trying to position ourselves as if we have all the solutions for how these things can be reconciled in every territory. But what we feel like we can contribute is asking critical questions and hosting spaces where people can, Métis young people can think more critically about what their responsibilities are and how we can be in good relationship. And then also, being guests and community members when living outside of our homeland. So noting that those relationships shift a little bit, or there's nuances to conversation when we're outside of the homeland as well. And again, for me, as someone living in the Toronto area, that's of particular importance to me. Just to add then, for many Indigenous nations, or according, to many of the values we carry, our relationship to land is holistic and multifaceted. So we're talking about mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional dimensions there. And storytelling to us is a way that we can strengthen relationship to land through all of those different levels. By exercising relationality. So we see storytelling as actually being, a key focus point for how people are in relationship to land. So we think about how it helps us be present with land in the sense of, even looking through digital photos, watching documentaries of being on land and learning about our histories there. It's allowing us to connect to our memories of place. And then also to celebrate and share current experiences that we're having, having some of our collective members sharing photos amongst our group and on social media of harvesting work that they're doing, a range of different ways of sharing, past, present, and then also future. What are our dreams of being together again in the future? And that can include, hopes for the future of us as a people having more opportunities to come together, but also of our individual relationships with one another, and with our collective that we hope to come back again.
That's something that we're working on at the moment, is developing what our next gathering will look like, because we wanted to have another gathering, but clearly we want to protect people's health and the health of our communities as well. So instead of thinking about maybe not being able to have an in-person gathering, we're planning a virtual gathering where we can use some of these emergent technologies and bring our community members together to tell their stories about different issues that are currently really impacting them, and try to create a guiding document for our work going forward, in ways we can see ways that we can really mobilize that work and those priorities that are identified by our community members. So I did want to share a few different excerpts from the zine. So I'll read this one here. This is a short excerpt, but and maybe we can drop the link in the chat, Lindsay, to the zine if anyone wants to read the full zine. So this piece was submitted by Cassidy Curran and Paul Robitaille. So I'm just going to read this piece here. To the unwitting traveler, it may have appeared that the camp functioned entirely through telepathy or extrasensory perception. Each person knew what needed to be done. Few needed to be asked to take on a task, certainly not twice. Locals and newcomers alike, each person pitched in to his or her own interest and ability. Each was grateful for the contributions of others. Each took time to express their sincere gratitude for even the smallest contributions, an act of kindness. Each shared in the harvest bounty equally. If you want to speak to this piece of it, Lindsay.
I was just doing a frantic search. I didn't have the link ready to go, but yeah, we wanted to pull that one. There's some other pieces. I have the full zine here, and I just found it beautiful. So Paul and Cassidy are talking about their time in Saskatchewan, going to Pine House Lake and being part of the harvesting camp, and just their words captured really beautifully all of the relational sounds and sights of what it really felt like to actually just be present with one another on the land. And so being able to share that with other people and to capture that story, both as a memory for them, but also as, something to bring comfort to us as we read it while we're disconnected a little bit, is just, yeah, I thought it was a beautiful example. And those photos there on the slide as well are contributed by one of our collective members, Jason, who has spent time being part of these camps as well. And then this is another part of the zine who responded to visiting. And although it might seem like we're straying a little bit away from the focus on like waterways to our homeland, for us, again, storytelling and artistry and creative writing, that is how we're using technology to get back to homeland in these digital ways. So this poem speaks to it in a little bit of a different way. It says, within the honeycomb of my bones is resistance. I'm reminded of this when I sink my sunken body into the contours of Ogimao Aski. I am greeted by glowing red grandfathers, the ancient ones who extend beyond the physical struggle of existence. They teach me resistance. Chin up, Akimeo. Keep going. Do your sacred dance, the way it was meant to be. When we come together, all we do is ceremony. Each one has a role. Chapan told the stories, Kukum made them neck bones, and I sponged up those medicines. Not every gathering felt like ceremony. Some nights we were filled with family feuds, black eyes under black skies. We aren't perfect. We aren't furbished. Our moccasins got holes in them, but when we come together, we heal. Might be too real, but altogether, it's all about how you feel. I may not be perfect, but I'm learning how to deal just like Muslim in those Texas Hold'em tournaments. Sometimes I feel like like's just about torment, but then I sit down and vent. Call you up there in the spirit world. You keep telling me, Akameamo. So I guess that's all I really got to know. So again, there's, I hope, some of you enjoyed hearing that poem, and it's a nice interruption to us talking about this in a more academic way, I guess. But that's what we want to do, is we want to offer opportunities for very different commentaries, very different insights in what it means to be on land. Because again, like, relationship to land is not only hunting and harvesting. Those are key parts of many of our cultures, but playing Texas Hold'em, gossiping, venting, these things, they're all different memories and experiences that we have, and they are part of those relationships in different ways.
This piece also really ties into that idea that kind of this project came from, or one of the many ideas this project came from, about showing those different ways that Métis culture exists, right? Like, we're not just an essentialized people that jig and bead and that's it, right? If Métis culture is much more vast than just kind of those cultural aspects that are presented in public. So I thought this is a really important piece to show that complexity and that depth in culture as well. And this piece was from another collective member, Justin Weeb, as well as Charmaine Dumont-Budd. And so this was a poem about the recipe for bannock.
Actually, I think it's the verbatim. They wrote down exactly how their cook described the recipe, which is pretty cool.
Beautiful. Oh yeah, sorry. So Lillian shared it, and then they wrote it down. And submitted it as part of this zine issue. So I'll just read the recipe out loud for everyone. So Lillian's bannock recipe in her own words. Get a good sized dish, holds a good amount. First start with flour, just enough to fill a good sized dish. A good amount. Gestured with her hands, the appropriately sized dish. Baking powder, not too much, just enough. Little salt, not too much. Then you add cold water, has to be cold water. That's just the way. You add some lard, just enough. Mix together. Mix good and push the dough out. Poke with a fork and bake at a good temperature. About how high? About 350 until nice and golden. Same with fried bannock. except cut up and sliced dough with 2 lines. Fry in cooking oil until brown. It's this poem, I guess not poem, but poem-like recipe. The first time I read it, because it reminded me so much of my auntie telling me how to make bannock. It was never, I mean, the temperature is very nice on the on the oven, because I never got a temperature from my auntie, but right recipes are just shared in a different way. So it's that idea of like those traditions that are passed down through family.
Yeah, I think it also makes me think about how, again, the limitations of these technologies, the limitations of writing, where it's like, sure, you can have a recipe written down, but that's not what makes the food, right? Like there's so much more beyond that. It's how we grow the food, the plants to contribute the ingredients. It's how we actually are in a kitchen together, and there's all the stories that go around these different recipes, and the like extra instructions that are between the lines of the actual recipe. So not sure if that resonates with anyone else on the call, but I hope it makes you think about, you know, when we're all back together with our families again, those chances we'll have to come together through food. Okay, just keeping an eye on time. So we wanted to more specifically dive into how we've responded to COVID-19. So we, as the Mamawi Project, have been using technologies to foster connection and knowledge mobilization since before the pandemic happened, because of, again, the need to connect those of us who are disconnected physically in different parts of the homeland and outside of it. And so we have been thinking, you know, as the pandemic hit, of what opportunities we have as an already existing platform and tool for connecting people in our communities, for what we can offer, or how we can continue to, you know, pay attention during this moment of what we can learn and how we can shift our organizing differently. And, you know, I've heard from a number of different people and knowledge keepers commenting on the need to think with respect about the COVID-19 virus, and not in a way that downplays the severity of what's happening, or the tragedy of the deaths that are happening, and the inequities that we've seen happen, but to know that we're always in relationship, even to a virus. And for us, that includes, you know, that commitment to paying attention to what this time is teaching us. So we're thinking about how can we mobilize care through technologies differently. So the check-ins we have with one another, we've had some almost like a Secret Santa, but we just did like a care exchange where we mailed each other different creative gifts that we did. We've done calls with people in our networks that one another are recommending we check in on, and even just, again, using our posts to let people know that we're still here, we're still finding ways to connect, and finding ways to show care. And then other things we're trying to pay attention to in this moment is how can we engage in dialogue differently in ways that are intersectional and attend to the convergence of threats at this time. So again, we're not just dealing with COVID-19, we're thinking about huge threats and issues around capitalism, racial violence, climate change. And there's a need to take this moment and to engage in dialogue and host spaces where we can think intersectionally about all these things happening, and how us as individuals are placed with different power and privilege within that. And then lastly, how can we think about accountability, learning, and collaboration, and political engagement differently? So the top photo there, Dear Métis Leaders, Visions for a Healthier and Stronger Métis Nation. This isn't just done by the Mamawi Project. Some of our collective members have at different times collaborated with other Indigenous folks that are organizing, and other Métis groups that are organizing, where there's been a number of concerns we've had with some of our political leaders that are taking stances on things that go against our values and the futures we're trying to create. And so working collaboratively to put open letters out, you know, acknowledging that a letter in itself is not going to solve things, but the more that we can have these conversations, the more that we can put in writing our understanding and our stance and dissatisfaction with things that some of our leadership are doing, I think it's a step for supporting one another and to actively engage, whether or not we're operating within our formal political leadership structures.
And then the photo on the bottom there is from another initiative that came up during the COVID pandemic. It was a shirt that was designed, was it you and Justin that designed that, Lindsay? Yeah, so with a bunch of different names that the Métis have called themselves in different times and different places. So this shirt became really like something that brought people together. People were really excited about, having conversations as well, right? Showing their pride in their culture, but also so many really interesting dialogues came up about the different terms, about people's family stories, about, even being uncomfortable with the terms that we chose to include on the shirt, right? So it was a really interesting way to kind of spark that kind of conversation in that digital space.
And this was, one of our responses, as I mentioned at the beginning, the identity politics happening within and outside of Métis communities of who is and isn't Métis. This is our take on that, to say like, okay, these are important conversations and we're interested in being a part of them, but we want to approach it from a way that's pushing our learning with more depth. And so doing that research and learning about these terms, and they're not only words that we use to describe ourselves, but they come from our relationships with other Indigenous nations who we have long ties with, and examples of strong solidarity in the past. So if we're talking about who is and isn't Métis, for us, we're more interested in okay, those of us who are Métis, like how do we understand that within the context of our histories and our relationships with place and other Indigenous nations. And this is just another cute example, a great example from the zine. We had a submission from Sabrina McNabb, who's a Métis educator, a teacher in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and she had her, I think, grade 3 class submit responses to what Keokewen meant to them. And we thought this was really cool as a way to not underestimate our even younger people, and to welcome their voices through technology and mobilizing their perspectives on how they understand, some of our values. So there's a few there, and there's a ton of them. If you check out the zine, which will track down the link. Or if you just Google it, you can find it on our Medium account and learn more about that.
So we thought we'd finish the session today by having just a little bit of a conversation about these 2 questions that I've posed here. We haven't actually talked about these questions or talked this out together before, but we thought it might be an interesting time to kind of to look at these issues. And also, if folks have thoughts themselves, we'd love to hear from all of you. Make this actually a dialogue instead of just us talking at you for even more time. So maybe I might actually stop sharing my screen and invite anyone to turn their camera on if they wish, or to type in the chat as well. And I'll actually post the questions in the chat, so we don't have to use the share screen here. 1 second. Perfect. So the first question, maybe I'll just pose it to you first, Lindsay. Are there any drawbacks to centering praxis on an online homeland?
I'm just seeing, these questions for the first time today, and I've been trying to sit with it. So some of these thoughts are not perfectly articulated, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is a drawback or a risk or a challenge, maybe thinking about it in that way, is that learning and relationship work, acknowledging that learning and relationship work, so much of it, or distinct pieces of it, comes from physical interactions and informal time, right? Like there's some things that we cannot replicate. I remember, just before, was it Back to Batoche? I can't remember if it was Back to Batoche or MNC meeting and being in a canoe with a bunch of other Métis folks and spending that time paddling down the Saskatchewan River, and that experience and those conversations, and we were singing songs that were like not even Métis songs. I'm talking about like 90s hip hop. Like we were just having a blast in different ways. And that can't be replicated. That physical experience of being on that water and of laughing together, that can't be replicated online. And so similarly, these virtual sessions and things, yes, we can talk, but we're limited in the sense where like one person can talk at a time. Whereas we know that we're in a physical gathering together, we're all having side conversations, we're joking before and after sessions, all of these things. And so I think it's just a reminder to myself that there are some things that can't be replicated, and we need to be conscious of that to know the limitations of what we're trying to do.
I would say I had a very similar thought to that question, because as I was talking about the journeying home gathering earlier, all the really rich moments in that gathering for me were the times, like when you're walking to the next place we're going and you're beside someone and you're just like chatting about whatever you had just seen or whatever you had just experienced, and you're able to kind of talk through some of those ideas and build your own understandings and come to new conclusions together. And a lot of things kind of came out of those conversations later on as well. Mm-hmm. For me, as well as the ceremony. I miss ceremony because I just don't feel comfortable, I guess. I know some folks do, but I personally don't feel comfortable yet going back into ceremonial spaces. So I think that I haven't yet figured out a way to kind of share in the same kind of way through digital technologies. But I think there's possibility there too, right? Because like ceremonies bring you closer to creator, but creators everywhere. So you don't need to be in a lodge for ceremony to take place. So that's just, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just knowing that anything, like when we think of technologies as tools, a tool isn't something that can be applied in every situation, right? So we're learning about these tools and we're learning about what the limitations are, how we can use them respectfully and carefully in ways that are protective of our people and our knowledges, and paying attention to ways when maybe they aren't, or they are causing harm, or they're being disrespectful. And on that note, I also think about the combative nature of online spaces. We've been pretty fortunate on our social media channels. There hasn't been too many throwdown fights in our comment sections, but that's something I think about the limitations as well, is like we're grappling with what kind of ethics or protocols do you set up to talk about some of the hard things we want to talk about in online spaces. And even then, like, how do we support people? You could have an elder or someone providing different supports for those who are either triggered or just having a hard time or just following as a debrief. But what that looks like in online spaces is a bit more challenging. So I'm curious if anyone else, it's okay if you don't, but if anyone would be willing to share in the chat or unmute yourselves, if anyone has any thoughts to add on that.
Someone added a great point in the chat that it can be difficult to get involvement from elders online, as well as people who don't have consistent access to internet. Yeah, and strong access. Right now we're lucky, right? We all have this really strong Wi-Fi signal, I guess, to be here, but plenty of folks don't have that ability. That's a really important point. Thank you. Hi, Laura.
Hi. So tomorrow in my talk, we'll be talking about online and how to create connection and what we've been able to do in an online platform and world. But to your point, I'm sure there are drawbacks, but this year there have been just so many positives of being able to connect with Métis people who are coast to coast to coast. I mean, we are able to move. We're able to move out of the homeland. And so we've run events where we have beaters, literally from coast to coast, from Halifax to Victoria, and way up north. My way up north is like Thompson, like way up north to Thompson and Churchill, have been able to come and join us and get that sort of sense of home and their homeland, even though they have to work and live in a place that isn't of theirs, right? And so, I mean, we've just seen so much impact from being able to access through social media, through the various channels that we're using to just talk and be with other Métis folks. I mean, so I don't know, maybe there's like one or two drawbacks, but I do think that the positives far outweigh, especially for those who have access to internet. Like if we can, you know, if you have internet, then there's really like no limit to what we can do collectively. On May 25th, we're going to have a meeting. Lindsay, you should come. We're having a meeting of like over 25 Métis scholars from across the country just to come and be and chat about nothing, you know, and to just have relationship and be in relationship, which wouldn't be possible. Like we couldn't all fly to just come chat with me in my living room. It's just not possible. So I think there are some real things that are opening up because of it. And it's also opening up a whole host of discussions around for those folks. What if you are in a different homeland? What if you're in someone else's homeland, right? And what is that like? And what is that experience? And then you can draw strength from our community, from the homeland, to be able to support you in the work that you're doing outside. So I think, you know, I'm like raw total positive about the internet, if you have it, and what it can do for us creating a space online with thousands of Métis folks.
Mm-hmm. What I love of what you just shared, one of the pieces anyway, and thank you for that invite. Lucy shared it. I have it in my calendar for the June 5th, but what you said about sitting together to talk about nothing, and that's the most refreshing thing to hear, because I think a lot of people get Zoom burnout. I know I'm feeling that lately, especially when there's pressure of like very jam-packed agendas to get through while you're staring at this screen. So the thought of just sitting and actually visiting without too much pressure is so nice to think about.
I think that mentorship piece is also so interesting to me. For me, like it's kind of predated, I guess, the COVID pandemic, but one of my first kind of experiences with that cross homelands mentorship was when I first started becoming more active on Twitter and engaging with other Métis scholars. Chris Anderson, who's at University of Alberta, reached out, and we just started kind of talking about what I was researching and all these things. And I was telling him, like, I'm struggling with writing this paper I have to write, which is also the story of my life. But he recommended a book, and I thought, oh, I'll check that out after next payday. And then within a few days, there was a package for me at my work. And he actually just bought the book and mailed it to me and said, you know, here you go. I hope you like it. If you don't, give it away. Okay, right? So like, it was like the internet can do so many amazing things to bring people together in ways that we just didn't have access to before. Oh, we have
some other good comments in the chat. Another addition from I hope I'm pronouncing this right, from Leah, about how online presence can help or be helpful for people with disabilities who may have trouble leaving their home. Yeah, for sure. A more accessible way of connecting with one another, and even paying attention to, over the pandemic, how platforms have evolved to, you know, allow for subtitles, for transcriptions, for I've even seen, actually it was for this conference in the whatever the platform is called, there's an option to click through of different ways to view your screen depending on different accessibility needs, and I think that's pretty great. Melissa also writes, the use of technology increases the visibility of views that are different than our governing Métis bodies. Us youngish Métis are able to not feel alone in those views and know that there are other Métis out there that feel the same way. Shared experience and views leads to potential changes and movements. Yeah, Lucy, what do you think? That's so much of that resonates a lot with us.
Absolutely. That's so much of what kind of motivates us to keep going and to come together in the first place, to know that, you know, we can come together, we can co-create a different experience for ourselves and for other Métis citizens across the homeland. We don't have to be kind of defined by the government bodies that we don't necessarily agree with, right? So I think that's a really incredible opportunity.
And what we're trying to push people to see too is that dissent or disagreement from other people who are positioned in leadership positions, you know, it doesn't mean that we don't want to be engaged in our governance processes. It means that we're using the tools that we have and we're trying to redefine what engagement actually looks like. So just because, you know, maybe we're not interested in participating in a formulated like youth council, we're showing up, and we very much want to constructively build our nation, and our critique is not coming from a place of, you know, just wanting to point the finger and not do anything. Like, we're here and we're trying to mobilize knowledge and perspectives so that people feel more engaged, where I would say over the past however many years, there's more and more disengagement because people aren't seeing themselves within leadership or, you know, perspectives that are sometimes coming out of those bodies. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Any last comments from anyone in the group who wants to add on to anything we've talked about?
Laura, you still have your video on. I would love to know if you have just any other thoughts related to that too. Or not, that's okay.
Well, I think that there's many different ways that youth can get involved in the nation, and I think that we have to appreciate that the voices of the 5 presidents don't necessarily represent the thousands of Métis people in the homeland, and so we do have to provide other channels for them to speak out and to be heard, not only for our own governance but also for the mainstream society, that there is a difference between one man and all of us, or, you know what I mean, like, or the directions in which the governing bodies are taking that aren't necessarily guided by referendum, right? And so and there needs to be an outlet for people to speak against that, so that the nation doesn't go too far out from where the youth want them to be when they get into places of power later in their lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to what is governance. So there's different understandings of governance and what that looks like. And for me, thinking about how governance is actually embodied is, you know, outside of these formal structures, and it really is the values that you're walking with every day. And so we're trying to tap in with that as well, to say, okay, we want to be part of, you know, those more formalized governance conversations, but we also want to encourage people to, from an accountability point of view, and along with those values we described, like, what are you doing in your everyday life to govern yourself? And you have power over how you choose to put your energy, how you relate to other people in your family, in the community, wherever you are. You have power there, and part of that comes from governance of, you know, teachings that you carry with you too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've always,
one of the things that we need to do is, especially is to, over the next year for our Métis, other than in Saskatchewan, which is too late, it's happening right now, but for the other governing bodies, elections are coming. And so if youth want to see a change, they need to do those formal procedures to become eligible to vote and really decide the future of the nation and have a voice that way. And also working in the other spaces, informal spaces, but to affect change for those who negotiate on our behalf with governments in a nation-to-nation relationship, we need to be able to be eligible to vote. And I think that's something, especially here in Manitoba, that's going to come up in the next 12, 14 months, is we're going to have an election. And so will we have enough youth to have a voice to affect change? Well, that will depend on the movement towards getting registered to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And holding that you can affect change in multiple ways all at the same time. It doesn't have to be like, okay, you're only going on one view.
Absolutely. And, you know, as Métis people, we've always dissented and disagreed and had those deep, long conversations and arguments, and right. So like, we have to look at that kind of disagreement and those different ideas of how to govern as an inherent part of our nationhood as well, right? Like, it's not a threat for youngish folks to be saying that's not okay with me. That's how we've always held ourselves accountable to each other. So how do we bring back those traditional ethics from our communities into our governance structures now?
I wonder if there's any last thoughts from others in the group. Too easy. I was expecting some curveballs. But Lucy, I don't know if you have any last thoughts. Otherwise, I was just gonna thank everyone. You know, it's very true that we're spending a lot of time online, and as we've discussed today, there's so many positives of that. There's opportunities of it to engage and show care for one another. But I'm every day, especially lately, being reminded that we need to also take care of ourselves outside of the screens too. So. On that note, Lucy, final sign off?
Yeah, just thank you all for coming. I've dropped a link to our Facebook in the chat. So if you want some more screen time and want to get with what we're doing, feel free to reach out and get involved in some of these initiatives, because we always are happy to have more engaged youngish folks along for the work. So merci everyone.
Take care.